So this truck driver pulls into a truck stop late one night. He orders a hamburger, french fries, a cup of coffee. And his meal comes, and just when his meal comes, the door of the truck stop flings open, and in walk these three bikers, you know the types, Hell's Angel types, leather and tattoos and sneaky. They go up and gather around the truck driver sitting there at the counter. The guy thinks this is going to be bad. And one of them leans over and he grabs his hamburger. He takes a bite out of it. The next one reaches over his shoulder and grabs a whole handful of french fries and shows them. And he stands up. And he grabs his bill. And he walks over to the cashier and pays his bill. And he walks out of the diner. And the biggest biker in the group looked over at the waitress and he goes, "That's not much of a man." And the waitress says, "I don't know about that, but he's not much of a truck driver either. Because he just rode over top of 3 motorcycles." This next story is allegedly true, but I don't know. It's supposed to be written on the tombstone of a cowboy in Logan City, Utah. These are the 5 rules for men to follow if you're going to have a happy life. Number 1, it's important to have a woman who helps at home, cooks from time to time, cleans up, and has a job. Number 2, it's important to have a woman who can make you laugh. Number 3, it's important to have a woman who you can trust and who doesn't lie to you. Number 4, we knew this was coming because it's a guy list, right? It's a little off color. Number 4, it's important to have a woman who is good at certain marital activities and likes to be with you. Number 5, it is very, very important that these 4 women do not know each other. Or you can wind up dead like me. Forgiveness. I guess those women weren't very forgiving, but what could you expect, right? Well, this is week number 4 in our series on forgiveness. We have looked at forgiveness from various angles in the last month or so. Last week we moved into the application phase of this series. And what it shows us our text, this little line that is embedded in the middle of the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus is teaching us to pray, and he says, when you pray, pray this. Pray, Lord, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And so last Sabbath we talked about seeking forgiveness. And this Sabbath we'll talk about granting forgiveness. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And by the way, since this is our year of the family, this is a good time to share this line. I heard it said once that a godly marriage is the union of 2 forgivers. Isn't that a beautiful picture for marriage? The union of 2 forgivers. Because in our more honest moments, we would have to confess that there is much that we need to be forgiven for. Now, those of you who were here last Sabbath, you remember that we worked our way through a list of 6 points that were generated by Dr. Richard Marks, who's from an organization called Marriage for Life. Well, today we're going to look at the rest of this list, which talks specifically about how to grant forgiveness. And the first thing that Dr. Marks says that we need to do when granting forgiveness is he says the first thing you do is you acknowledge your pain and your anger. In other words, we could say, just go ahead and allow yourself to feel disrespected. And he argues that there's great value in that it's okay. He says when that feeling comes, that someone has done something which is offensive, it's disrespectful, it's degrading, he says it's okay that you feel that way and that you recognize those feelings. He says you don't need to kick against that. Sometimes we take stuff way too seriously, don't we? And it's almost like we're emotionally trying to protect ourselves, and we're emotionally trying to insulate ourselves from that feeling of being disrespected or that feeling of being degraded. So it's almost like we're unwilling to just say, that was hurtful. Or maybe in some way that threatens our ego a little bit to say, yeah, that happened and I found it wounding. I found that a difficult thing. He says, don't do that. He says, don't vigorously protest the way that you're being treated and the emotional experience that treatment may bring into your lives. He said there's an alternative. You just say, okay, and you recognize reality and you recognize that happened. Paul talked about this in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 7, where he was writing to this church where the relationships in the church had fallen apart so badly that people in the church were suing each other. Can you imagine going to church like that? Yeah? I mean, how does the pastor handle that exactly? He's doing an illustration. He says, so how many of you are currently a plaintiff in a lawsuit against you, the guy sitting at the pew next to you, right? I want the plaintiffs on this side, the defendants on this side this morning. I mean, imagine trying to pastor a church like that. So Paul's writing the book of Corinthians to this little congregation, and one of the things he says, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 7, he says, why do you not rather accept the offense? Isn't that interesting? He says, just accept that. You don't need to resist it. You don't need to kick against it. You don't need to insulate yourself. You don't need to do sort of that faking, like, oh, it's no big deal. It didn't matter, right? Whatever. He says, no, just accept that happened. Just accept the offense. In other words, do a stop, look, and a listen. And ask yourself, if you're getting ready to put yourself and the other person through something by retaliating or by choosing to hang on to those feelings of resentment or bitterness, ask yourself if you're getting ready to retaliate in a way that's bad for you and bad for them. Just accept the offense. Accept that took place. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 says, love is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. So accept it. And I think one of the great values of that, when we just accept an offense, is once you recognize reality and you accept that is the thing that happened, then it's a little easier to let that pass through you so that you can genuinely let it go. You've been around these experiences where someone tells you a story, and you can tell by the way they're telling you the story that it was very hurtful to them. But then at the end of the story, they go, oh, it doesn't matter. And then you inquire as to when this took place, and it was years ago. Oh, so it doesn't matter. It's no big deal. But here you are continuing to talk about it for a period of years. Right? He says you don't need to do that. He says if it was a hurtful event, just recognize it was a hurtful event. Accept that. Embrace it so that you can then choose to let it go. Number 2, he says be specific about your future expectations and limits. There's sort of a balancing principle to number 1. This is where the boundary thing comes into play. We've talked a lot about boundaries in this series. Let me answer a couple of questions about boundaries. Number 1, are boundaries healthy? Number 2, do boundaries honor God? You guys were slower to respond on that one. I want to talk about that for a minute. I do this a lot in counseling. I talk with people about boundaries, and sometimes I get a response from people when I'm talking about, wow, the reason you're so upset, the reason you're so hurt right now is there's a significant boundary violation that's taking place. And really the most productive conversation that you and I could have is a conversation about how to recognize that and then to reinforce those boundaries and communicate that the boundaries are there. You know what the response is that I get from people a lot of times? The response is kind of like, that's not really a godly thing to do. Almost like it's a selfish thing to do. It's selfish for us to sort of impose our boundaries and reinforce our boundaries with other people. I think this kind of thinking happens as early as cradle roll sometimes. Do you remember, those of you that grew up in the church, do you remember a little thing that you learned in cradle roll that says, Jesus first, others, and yourself? You remember that? It was a little cliche. We did that every Sabbath when I was there. Jesus first, others second, yourself last. And sometimes when you talk with people about establishing personal boundaries, there's almost a little bit of a feeling like, well, it's not really godly, or that's not really spiritual work, or maybe it's even a little bit selfish. Isn't that a little bit like just throwing yourself out there and kind of insisting that you're going to have your own way? No, that's not really what that is. Setting boundaries is a healthy and an appropriate thing to do. If you want to do an interesting read of the Gospels, do this. Go back and reread the life of Christ. And look for all the places where Jesus set boundaries with people. And you'll find it in his life. Particularly the people that misrepresented the character of his Father. The people that presumed to speak for God, but they spoke of him in ways that were not accurate. You see, that violates the family boundary of the Godhead, and Jesus was real clear. He was real clear about that. Another one that comes immediately to mind, we talked about it a couple of weeks. You remember Jesus getting smacked in the face by the high priest servant? And Jesus says, "Why did you strike me?" You know, that establishes a boundary. Just when something like that happens, when someone does something that's offensive, and you say, "Why did you do this and so?" And you identify it, you name it, you put a name on it, and you kind of drag it out in the light, that causes people to kind of sit up and go, oh, wait a minute, right? That's a gentle way of recognizing that the boundary has been violated and sort of bringing that out into the open. This is part of number 2, being specific about your future expectations and limits. A biblical story that comes to mind, one of my favorite Bible stories, the book of Daniel, chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3, you know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the broader context of that story is, remember what took place in Daniel chapter 2? Daniel chapter 2 was a strange man of blood and metal. The king has this dream of this image of all these different types of metals. And finally he brings Daniel in and he says, what does it mean? And Daniel says, well, part of what it means, O king, is that one day your kingdom is going to pass away. And the king didn't like that. So in the very next chapter, chapter 3, we now have the king establishing an image, an idol that is all gold. Now remember Daniel chapter 2, it was just the head of gold, and the head of gold represented Babylon. But one of the points of the prophecy is that kingdom would eventually pass away. And so now in chapter 3, you have the king establishing an image that is all gold from head to toe. Isn't it interesting? The context is sort of, my kingdom will never pass away, and I defy the living God, and I stick my hand in his face. That's sort of the context of what's taking place in Daniel chapter 3. So Daniel chapter 3, the king establishes this golden statue. The thing is 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. And he brings people in from every part of his kingdom, which basically encompassed the known world. And so he has a worship service for everybody in the world, or at least from representatives of everybody in the world. And he calls them all in, people from all over the realm. And he says, now here's how this is going to go. We've assembled this orchestra. And when the orchestra plays, that's your cue to fall down on your face and to worship the image of gold that I have set up. And in the big context of the story, he's saying, I defy the living God, and my kingdom will last forever. That's the context of the story. We pick up the story in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 12. Chapter 3, verse 12. The music plays, and the whole kingdom falls down, and they worship. But then, there are these men that come to the king, and they say this. They say, King, there are these certain Jews who you have set over the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. O king, they have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was in a rage and a fury, and he commanded, bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you're ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, the symphony of all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you should be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hand? That's one of the most important moments in the chapter right there, because that's what this chapter is really about. There is a tug of war going on between the God of heaven and the one who had called himself the God of this world, the king of Babylon. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. understand this was high drama in before the king. Nobody talked to the king that way. For the king to call you in and to threaten you with death, and for your response to be, I don't need to say anything to you. I don't need to respond to you. I don't need to answer your inquiry. You got to understand the drama that was taking place. Verse 17, they go on. If this is the case, our God, whom we serve, what did King Nebuchadnezzar say? Who is the God who will be able to deliver you from my hand? If this is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. You know who I would like to really hear this story from? I would like to hear this story from the other people who were in the king's court. Can you imagine? Oh, those guys. You don't do that. You don't get to talk to the king that way. Nobody talks to the king of Babylon that way. They just stood up in front of this whole public drama and they called the king out in front of everyone. Imagine the egos that are involved and the face that the king is going to lose if the king does not follow through. And it says that the next verse says that his countenance changed and he was in a fury and his countenance toward them changed. You know the story. He heats up the oven 7 times hotter than it's ever been heated before. The Bible says that the men who were attending the oven was so hot that they died and they weren't even in the oven. And he has the 3 Hebrews thrown into the oven, fiery furnace. And as he throws them in, expecting to see them just ignite into flame, nothing but charred, smoking remains left, he looks and he sees 4. And he turns to his vice president and he says, well, didn't we throw 3 men in? There's 4 men in there. And one of them looks like the Son of God. And he calls them. He says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come forth. And he comes forward, and it says the 3 men come forward and they approach the throne. They step out of the fiery furnace. They just get mobbed with all of these administrators, the governors, and the satraps, and the king's presidential council. They get mobbed, and the men are looking at them, and they're touching them, and they're feeling their clothes with their fingers, and they're smelling them, and not even a hair of their head was singed. Who is the God who will deliver you from my hand? O God, O King, we will not worship your gods or the image that you have set up. Look at the end of the story, verse 29. The king is trying to respond. He's trying to save some face. He's trying to recover from this. And he says, therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, language that speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces. Their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah, I bet he did, right? Who is the God who shall deliver you from my hand? My God will. Our God will. Our God, the God who created heaven and earth, he is the God of all gods. He is the King of kings. What they were doing is they were doing number 2. They were setting limits and expectations about the future of how this whole thing was going to go. They were setting boundaries in a very, very clear way. When granting forgiveness, be specific about your future expectations and your future limits. It's a good thing and it's a godly thing to set boundaries and to set expectations about your future expectations and limits. Number 3, give up your right to get even, but insist on being treated better in the future. Communicating clearly about how something was hurtful charts the course for a future success in the relationship. You know why I like that? Because when you do that, you're saying, I want a relationship with you. I want to stay in fellowship with you. I want us to have a successful experience together. They say the opposite of love is not hate, but apathy. Isn't that interesting? 9 out of 10 people, if you say, what's the opposite of love? Without even thinking, they just say hate, right? Love, hate. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is apathy. Apathy is when you just don't care enough about the relationship to do anything or address anything or put mechanisms in place to make the relationship more successful. Apathy is when you say, I care so little about you and I care so little about this relationship that if it's going to shrivel up and die a natural death, I'm completely fine with that. I will just allow the natural progression of the relationship to go to its death state. That's the opposite of love. That's as far away from love as you can get. Number 3, giving up your right to get even, but insisting on being treated better in the future. Did you get it? That's different than apathy. It's a loving response. When you do that, you protect against apathy in a way that communicates a positive intent toward the future of the relationship. And it's just a loving way to respond. Number 4, let go of blame, resentment, and negativity toward your partner. Who stands to gain the most from that? You do. You do. Isn't it a burdensome thing to have to carry a grudge? It saps your energy. It leaves a negative imprint on your character. It limits the ability to experience joy and closeness in the relationship. And the list goes on and on. When you nurse a grudge, that is bad for you. When you hold a grudge, you get hurt. When you hold a grudge, you damage your own life. Let me ask you this question. Do you think that pastors and their relationships ever get tangled up with each other and have conflict? Do you know that actually happens between pastors from time to time? Do you feel a personal story coming on? There was this guy that I used to be friends with in college. But after a while, it was just like, that guy grates my nerves. He was a very arrogant, very self-centered, kind of a type A, brash, push people around kind of guy. And our senior year, we actually wound up taking a business course together, of all things. It wasn't even a religion course. And we wound up in a work group together. And near the end of our time there, things really came to a head. And he and I had a significant confrontation at the end of our work group that, had it been a little earlier in the semester, I think the teacher would have disbanded the work group. It was that bad. But we were almost done, but we got in a big fight. We don't like each other. Well, we graduated, never going to see the guy, I don't care. He got a call to a conference somewhere far away. Done. So, of course, he follows me up to seminary, as luck would have it. And as luck would have it, we took a class together. And as luck would have it, the teacher placed us in a study group together. Would you believe this same exact thing happened? But I didn't care. He's going to another conference, and I just wrote the whole thing off. Apathetic. That's bad. Yeah, 3 or 4 years later, he accepts a call to the Carolina Conference. And as luck would have it, they put him in the district next to me. As luck would have it, he buys a house about 500 yards from my office. Our churches were only 5 miles apart. U.S. and North Carolina people are going, let's see what's happening. Hendersonville, let's see what's the pastor there. You guys know what's going on in that pew over there. They're comparing notes. This guy's got the dirt on me. We're old friends. So, he moves in, and I'm just like, you gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me. Of all the people in North America they've got hired, they hire him. And I'm driving to church one morning, and as I'm pulling into my church, he passes me. He's on his way to his church. And you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking we are the biggest couple of hypocrites on the planet. I mean, I was probably preaching on forgiveness, and he was probably preaching on love that day. I just, And I'm like, okay, I got to get my heart right. I got to get this thing straightened out. So I called him. I said, let's go to lunch. We went to lunch. I took him to one of my favorite haunts. Lunch was just chit-chatting. It's kind of up here on the surface. We got done with lunch. We drove back to his church where I was going to drop him off. And I said, can I come in? He says, yeah, sure. So I came in. I sat on top. And I just said, hey, I don't like you. We're not getting along. We've got some history. But wow, isn't it interesting the way the Lord works in our lives and confronts us with things that we need to be dealing put you here 5 miles away. You know, I want to have integrity in my life. And we got these 2 pastors that aren't getting along. I got some stuff I need to apologize for. And so I apologize for some things. I said, you know, I want to be close to you and I want to have a strong relationship with you. And you know what he did? He peace faked. We learned in our peacemaking seminar, there's peacemaking, he peace faked on me. Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. I didn't know. I don't remember it that way. I guess I was having a little different experience. Yeah, well, okay, well, listen, hey, yeah, everything's fine. And at the time, I was like, that's a lie. And I had this moment of the flesh rising up, and I was wanting to, oh yeah, you know, but I was like, oh, forgiveness it's for him, but more importantly, it's for me. I don't get to make decisions for other people. I only get to make decisions for myself. Apparently, him saving face on that is really important to him. Just honor him, allow him to make his decisions, but you make your decisions. You need to come clean, you need to apologize, you need to offer and ask for forgiveness, and then you need to walk away from this. So that's what I did. Over the next year, we had some interactions, and they were positive, and they were polite, but it wasn't really a full reconciliation and restoration. About a year later, we did a funeral together. You know, interesting things happen at funerals, don't they? Sometimes at funerals, you get reminded of what's really important and what's not important. But we did a funeral together, and after the funeral, he said, can I talk to you? I said, sure. And he just came out, and he said, man, he said, that day you're in my office. He said, I just looked you right down and I lied. And of course, I'm wanting to go, yeah. He said, I'm really sorry. He said, I'm sorry for the lost opportunity. I'm sorry for the last year. I'm sorry for the years before it. He says, you know, you really caught me off guard. He says, Bob, you just used to be such a jerk. He says, but you know, you've like really changed. He's like, I don't like this, but I actually like you now. He says, you know, I just feel like we have potential to like really be brothers. And I was like, that's what I want. So a year afterwards, we got to do the thing that we were really supposed to do. I have to tell you, that relationship got really, really sweet. Got really sweet. We're still close. We don't get to talk a lot because he is actually, his ministry has taken him to another country. It's about South Carolina. No, I'm just kidding. He lives in another country, really. He's international now. So we get to email occasionally. I bumped into him at the seminary a couple of years ago. We had overlapping classes. We spent as much time together as we could. And I got to tell you, it is rich and it is beautiful. He's my brother. I won my brother back. And my life has been enriched because of the experience. Let me tell you, one of the things I love about this is because if he and I have a problem again, we know how to deal with it. We know how to resolve it. We know how to fix it. And we've already charted a course. We've already established a pattern and a history of this is the right way to work that out. And what it does is it just raises the level of potential and the level of safety in the relationship. And from the time we get together, we just hug each other and we're just like, you are my man. I love you. I just love you. And it's just been a beautiful, beautiful thing. You know, Ellen White says that most of the problems that bring isolation and anger in our relationships can be resolved in a 5-minute conversation if our hearts were right. Isn't that interesting? Letting go of that anger and bitterness, all that stuff. So let go of blame and resentment and negativity toward your partner. You stand to benefit greatly from such a decision. And if you don't, you stand to hurt greatly from such a decision. Harry Houdini, the famed escape artist, issued a challenge wherever he went. He said, you can lock me into any jail cell in this country, and he claimed that he would set himself free quickly and easily. And he did this over and over and over again. There are many stories of him going in, and they would take him through 5 layers of security in a jail, through 5 locked doors, big old fat-bellied Southern sheriff. Nobody's ever escaped out of my jail, you know. And he locks him in the deepest bowels of the prison. And he's walking out, and he's slamming doors behind him. And as he's slamming doors behind him, Houdini's right behind him, open the doors, following him down. Happened over and over again. News reports in the hundreds on this. He always kept his promise. Except for the time when something went wrong. Houdini entered a jail cell, and his street clothes, the metal doors clanged shut behind him. He took from his belt a concealed piece of metal. This was his secret. He had this little piece of metal that wrapped around. It was a flexible, long, little metal shaft. He would hide it in his belt, and he would use that to reach outside the cells and to pick the locks. So they walked in, they shut him in this jail cell. He set to work immediately, but as soon as he started, something seemed unusual about this lock. For 30 minutes he worked and got nowhere. An hour passed, and he still did not open the door. By now he was bathed in sweat and panting in exasperation, but he still could not pick the lock. Finally, after 2 hours of labor, Harry Houdini collapsed in frustration and failure against the door that he could not unlock. But as he fell against the door, it swung. It had never been locked at all. They tricked him. But in his mind, it was locked. And that was all it took to keep him from opening the door and walking out of the jail cell. When we hang on to blame, resentment, and bitterness, we imprison ourselves in a cell of our own devising. A cell that we could leave if we choose. Number 5, communicate your act of forgiveness to your partner. Have you ever been tempted to kind of forgive a person in your heart and just go on like everything is okay, but you don't really say anything about it? You don't really communicate. You've been tempted to do that? It's not the best. When you do that, you're withholding a wonderful gift from them. You're withholding something that greatly contributes to the restoration of the relationship. It is an act of kindness. It is an act of love to offer forgiveness in a way that is identifiable and in a way that clearly communicates that they are forgiven. Psalm 86, verse 5 says, "For you, Lord, are good and ready to forgive, abundant in mercy to all those who call upon you." You see God's actively participating in forgiveness in this text. Number 6, when safe to do so, work toward reconciliation. And let's remember that it's okay if this takes a while, especially if the offense is a deep offense, especially if the wound was a deep wound. It may take a period of time to rebuild that relationship and develop a track record of emotional and relational safety. And once again, this is the opposite of apathy, working toward reconciliation. This is a loving thing to do. We work toward reconciliation because as we do so, it reflects the character of God. Because God is into reconciliation with us. In our relationship with God, we were the offenders, yet God took the initiative to send His Son to pay for our sin and to map out a course of being reinstated in a right relationship with Him. And when we actively pursue reconciliation, we reflect what God is like. Is that an easy thing to do? It's hard work. And things may escalate and get a little dicey as you pursue reconciliation. Let's talk about taking a time out. Have you ever been in a discussion where things get a little too heated and you sense the need to take a time out? When you take a self-imposed time out, that can be a helpful tool. But have you ever had someone tell you, you need to take a time out? Was that helpful? No. Usually that's offensive. It comes across as though you're being dismissed, or as though this person thinks it's their job to manage you and to manage your emotions. A better way is for each partner to develop the emotional awareness to know when they themselves need a timeout, and then for them to call a timeout on their own behalf. But the rules state that if you call a timeout, it's a reasonable amount of time, perhaps between a few minutes and an hour. And then you take the initiative to re-engage that person, seeking to continue seeking a resolution. See, if you don't do that, the timeout can become an escape, can't it? I need a timeout, I'm out of here. That's just the word that you're using to transition out of the conversation. And if you call the timeout, then you're obligated to be the one that comes back and re-engages in the discussion. Now, how do you do that? How do you call a timeout? Well, first you recognize that you have a need for a timeout, and then you request it, and you suggest a time frame. You could say something like, look, I'm just too angry to talk right now. I need to take a 10-minute break. Or you could even use the term timeout. You could say, wait, timeout. I need 30 minutes. Just for me. Okay, no, you're fine. I need to take a break. I need 30 minutes. If I continue right now, the way this is going, I'm going to say things I'm going to be apologizing for later. I'd rather not hurt you, so I'd like to take a timeout. Then during the timeout, you try to relax and calm down, whatever that means. Take a walk, take a few deep breaths, read something, pray, reflect. Maybe try to think about the issue from the other person's perspective. And then finally you come back and you resume the conversation. What do you do if it goes from 0 to 60 really fast? We do. Take another time out. That's okay. Slow the conversation down. That's okay. It's okay if the conversation has chapters, if there's a break between chapters. That's better than inflicting hurt or being disrespectful or speaking to people in ways that leave them feeling degraded. It's better just to slow that whole conversation down and take the necessary breaks that you need to do so that you can manage your contribution, so that you can manage your own emotions in a way that's going to be helpful. Now, does that sound easy or hard when I say it that way? I find it very hard. I find it difficult. In my experience, this is hard work. But forgiveness is hard work. But it's hard work that carries a big payout. Mahatma Gandhi said this. He said, the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. So that means it's not going to be easy. It means it's going to be hard work. And that's okay. This is the sixth and final step, working toward reconciliation. It can be hard, but it's worth the effort. So, what's the sum of these 4 weeks that we have spent talking about forgiveness? What's it all mean? Hopefully it's more than just preaching. Hopefully it's more than just filling our liturgy up with programming so that we can worship on Sabbath morning the way we're supposed to or used to. Hopefully it's more than just an occasion to say a few amens. My hope is that this series has caused you to begin to seek and to grant forgiveness in a real and practical way. Because the skill of seeking and granting forgiveness is a skill that every Christian should possess. Why? Because that's what God does with us. It reflects God's character. We should possess this skill because we are the recipients of this amazing, amazing grace that God has offered to each one of us through His Son. And that's why we spent 4 weeks talking about it. That's why it's important. That's why it's a skill that you need to pursue and that you need to be highly motivated and engaged in developing those skills of granting and seeking forgiveness. Once upon a time, there was a seminary student. He was known as the Golden Boy. In my field, we've got this little term, we've got this little title, the Golden Boy. Every conference has a Golden Boy. Every graduating class has a Golden Boy. The Golden Boy is a title that goes to the one that shows the most promise. He is often the best preacher. He is often the best looking. He is often the best with interpersonal communication skills. He's often very bright intellectually and a straight-A student. He will usually be the first one to get a call, to get a job. Sometimes he gets a call his junior year. You know you're the Golden Boy when you get a call your to see him be able to do ministry on a national, perhaps even an international or a global stage. He was gifted in that kind of way. But then about midway through seminary, something happened. He did something. He did something bad. And I don't know what it is. It's supposed to be a true story. I don't know what it is that he did. He didn't, in the story, he didn't tell what he did. But he just said it was like, it was one of the Mac Daddy sins. It was one of the big ones. It was one of the ones that's going to go on your resume as the biggest sin you've ever committed, and it's going to follow you for a while. And this is the golden boy. And yet he did a little dance with the dark one, and he got tangled up into something bad. And it changed him. And it changed the course of his life. Upon graduation, he had numerous calls. But he took a call to Asia. He went to the mission field because he was doing a Jonah. He was trying to fix this thing and manage it himself. And he wanted to be in a place where nobody knew him and where there wasn't a chance of anyone knowing what he had done. He spends the first half of his career in Asia running from this thing. Not really in the center of God's plan for him. Not really in the place where God has called him to be. Now, Asia's a little different than us here in the West. Here in the West, we're very scientific. We give rational explanations for everything. We're very third dimensional. In Asia, there's a little bit more of the fourth dimension. There's a little bit more paying attention to the spiritual world, what spirits may be doing, interpretation of dreams and visions and following impulses and things like that. That's a stretch for us to understand that. It's a little different culture, and they interpret those things a little differently. In his church was this old woman who was revered as sort of the spiritual leader of the church. In fact, he was a little jealous toward her. And this old woman, people would come to her and ask for counsel, and she would say, "Let me talk to Jesus about that." And then she would come back a day or two later and give them an answer. And she would tell them what Jesus said. In fact, you know what she said? She said that every night when she prayed, Jesus came and sat down on the bed next to her and spoke to her. That's what he said. And this guy, particularly being a Westerner, he didn't believe it. That's not true. Jesus doesn't come to you every single night and reveal himself to you visually and sit down on your bed and carry on an audible dialogue with you. He just didn't believe it. In fact, he resented her stories. And one day, she was in his office, and she just made some casual comment about, Jesus told me that blah, blah, blah. And he was like, I've had it up to here. And so he says, so, Jesus comes and talks to you every night? Well, yes, Pastor. Oh, so Jesus came and talked to you last night? Yes. And he'll probably come and talk to you tonight, won't he? Well, I sure hope he does. He usually does. We talk every night. It's okay. He says, how about this? And without even thinking, these words came out of his mouth. He says, how about this? He says, how about tonight when Jesus comes and talks to you? How about you ask Jesus what I did in seminary? And she says, okay, Pastor. And she leaves his office, and no sooner did she leave when suddenly the reality of what he had done hit him, and he thought, what did I just do? Why would I say that? There were any number of 1,000 things I could have asked her to do to sort of prove that this is sort of a test, right? But what if? What if Jesus is coming to her? And what if he is talking to her? And what if he tells her? Do you know he did not sleep that night? It was a long, torturous, sleepless night. He was in his office the next morning much more early than usual. And he awaited the long hours of that morning, trying to stay busy with some type of administrative duties that he couldn't even focus on, until finally there was a faint little tap at the door. And he looked up, and there she was. And he said, come in. And he seated her on the couch, and he got up and he shut the door. says, so sister, you remember that you were here yesterday? And she said, yes. He says, and you remember what we talked about? She said, yes. And do you remember what I asked you to do? She said, yes. He says, and last night, did Jesus come to you? She says, yes, he did, Pastor. And he said, did you ask him? She said, yes, I did. He said, what did he say? He said that he couldn't remember. And she walked out. That's what our God is like. That's the kind of forgiveness that he extends to us. And that's what he asks us